Dun 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 dun! Ah! What is that? That is a broken wrist. Yep, and I've been in this thing for a couple of weeks now. Yep, so I fractured the large bone that runs through my arm, right where it attaches to my hand. Fractured the end of that off. And leave a comment below and take a guess on how you think I did it. Here's my paramotor. You can still see it's all in one piece. And here is the dirt bike. It's still all in one piece. So go ahead, take a guess. Let me know how you think that I broke my wrist. Good news is I only have, I don't know, a couple of weeks left, maybe 2, maybe 3 weeks left till I get the cast off. We'll be back sending it in the air. Maybe sooner than that. I might try and do some PG with the cast. I don't know. Check it out. But yeah, just wanted to give you an update, and then I think I'm gonna go record a video and just do some basic paraglider aerodynamics, and we'll talk about angle of attack and things like that. So here's my little airfoil that I've drawn, and let's go through the different forces and things that are acting upon this airfoil. This is your paraglider in flight. So the first thing is airspeed, obviously. So you're flying, your trims are in, and you're flying, no brake pressure is applied because your trailing edge isn't deflected. And so your airspeed is coming straight in like this. Why is the marker not going to work right now? Here's our airspeed force. The other thing that's happening as we're flying through the air is we're going to simplify it, we'll just not use motor thrust, we're just gliding in on approach. So that force is our sink rate. I intentionally drew this arrow shorter to show that we're traveling faster forward through the air than we are traveling downwards through air. And that kind of also gives us our glide ratio. Higher performance wings, you know, you're going to travel a further distance forward for every distance that you go down. These two things combined give you your angle of attack on the wing. So if you kind of consider your sink rate and how fast you're traveling through the air, your angle of attack probably is somewhere around here. And that's the difference between these two forces, your sink rate and your airspeed through the air. This also is under the assumption that the air we're flying through is perfectly smooth, or there's zero wind, and so this airspeed is a constant and our sink rate is constant. But we know in the real world that varies. The next thing that's different about paragliders versus other airplanes is we have a pendulum effect added because, note, this is not drawn to scale. So you have this pendulum effect, this weight underneath you. So the glider naturally wants to maintain a constant angle of attack. That angle of attack correlates with an airspeed. It's like your trim speed. Just like you can trim an airplane, a Cessna, you have the little trim wheel that you can adjust, and the airplane wants to fly at a certain speed. Now in an airplane, that is the correlation between the elevator and the airfoil, the wing itself. But on a paramotor or a paraglider, your trim speed depends on how much weight you're carrying, so how loaded the glider is, and the angle of attack that it wants to fly at, which can be changed by either your trimmers at the rear of the glider or how the factory trimmed the paraglider with the lines from the factory. Of course, you can trim a glider faster. You shorten the A lines and lengthen the D lines, it naturally wants to fly faster. But it has a specific trim speed that it wants to be at based on how much weight it's carrying, and the trims, that the length of the lines determines the trim on a paraglider. That speed, that trim speed, correlates with an angle of attack that it wants to be at. So they trim the glider to fly at 25 miles an hour, and just imagine in your head that 25 miles an hour is this specific angle of attack here. So the outside factors then come into play. all of a sudden you get a gust of wind that comes from behind you, right? So a gust of wind comes and it reduces your airspeed. So now our airspeed's reduced, which changes our angle of attack to the wing, because now these two arrows are close together. If they were the same force, then it would be like a 45-degree. So now our angle of attack is steeper. If you reduce your airspeed, but your sink rate remains the same, now this angle here has changed. But we said before that our glider was trimmed to want to fly at a specific airspeed because of the weight and the length of the lines. It wants to fly at 25 miles an hour. But from a gust of wind, our airspeed reduced down to 20 miles an hour or less. The numbers don't really matter. The airspeed is reduced, so now the glider wants to pitch forward to regain this angle of attack. So that's what it would do in flight. You hit a gust of wind from behind you, the glider surges forward because your airspeed decreased, and the glider wants to gain that angle of attack back. So it dives forward until it regains its airspeed. The airspeed comes back, and now our angle of attack returns back to that 25 mile an hour angle of attack that it wants to be at. All right, so we talked about a wind gust and how it can change your airspeed, which the difference between the airspeed and the sink rate determines your angle of attack. But that was only for constant, you're flying at a constant smooth airspeed, and then you get a wind gust from in front of you or behind you, and how that'll change. But we know that airflow doesn't just flow horizontally, there's also lift and sink. So what happens to our paraglider when we fly through lift? Well, now our sink rate is changing and our angle of attack is changing because of the relative wind airflow. The relative wind before, when we were flying, through smooth air, the relative wind was always coming from this direction. But now when there's a thermal coming up from here, we get an additional some lift here, and our angle of attack is now steeper. Now your new angle of attack when you're flying through the thermal is something like this, coming from this direction. So if you imagine the wind before was hitting the airfoil at this angle here and then flowing over, but now our angle of attack is steeper here. And if you don't apply any brake pressure, sometimes when you fly into a thermal, you feel the wing surge forward in front of you as you enter the thermal. And I believe that that's because the angle of attack has changed here. So whereas before the lift was created in this zone, now the lift is created more on the leading edge. And that's why you get that surge forward in the wing. The wing wants to bite into the thermal as you enter it. And then once you're in it, your angle of attack restabilizes to where it wants to be. And then if you're just coring in the thermal, it flies the same. But it's that initial pitch forward into the thermal is the angle of attack changing to where more of the lift is created towards the nose of the wing, and that makes the glider surge forward in front of the pilot. The opposite happens when you fly through sink. So let's say you fly through some sink, right? The air is now coming down. So when you first start to enter, so now we're going to fly through some sink. Here's some turbulent sink coming down on our wing. As we fly through it, it moves our angle of attack to a shallower angle because we've flown into some sinking air. This is sinking air that's coming down, which then changes our angle of attack to be shallower. Our sink rate increased, airspeed stayed the same. Our angle of attack is less. Less angle of attack means less lift, and also it's going to change where the lift is created on the airfoil. For classic profile airfoils at lower angles of attack, at lower angles of attack, the lift point changes and it moves somewhere back here. Whereas in normal flight, it's here, and then at steeper angles of attack, more lift is created here. So as you fly into the sink, the angle of attack is decreased, and now more of our lift is being created back here. Once again, our wing wants to regain the angle of attack, so as you exit, sometimes you'll feel the wing surge behind you. Right as you exit a thermal, you'll feel the wing kind of pitch backwards because the wing wants to regain this angle of attack. Once you're out of the sink, or you're in a large bubble of sinking air, and you're not in that transition phase, you're back in the large bubble of sinking air, the wing has already pitched back to regain the angle of attack, and now it's in constant sinking air, so it goes back to its normal angle of attack that it had before. So why do paragliders collapse? I think a lot of people think that a glider collapses because it's like an inflated balloon almost, and then when you fly through turbulence, it squeezes it and it pushes the air out, and that's what makes it deflate. I don't believe that's why you get a large asymmetric collapse or a frontal collapse. In my opinion, when the glider's inflated, it acts almost like a solid airfoil wing. And the reason you get a collapse is because the angle of attack goes negative on the wing, and I'll try to explain. If you fly through large enough sink, if you're in a thermal and you're climbing, and then you exit the thermal, so you're in the thermal, the air all around the airfoil is climbing up, your angle of attack is stabilized to where it wants to be. But as you exit the thermal, you have lift here being created still, but now you've entered the sink on this side. So your angle of attack at the leading edge of the wing has changed. And if the sink is strong enough, this angle of attack changes from this direction all the way here. And that's when you start to lose tension on your A-lines. And if the angle of attack becomes so negative because the pilot either didn't pull the brakes, didn't check the surge enough to tilt the wing back and regain this angle of attack, the sink became so great that now you have a little bit of lift being created here. There's no longer any lift here, but the trailing edge of our wing is still created lift. If you're in constant sink, then the angle of attack has stabilized back to where it wants to be, and your sink rate has just increased, so you're just falling faster through the sky. But it's that transition period going through turbulence where the angle of attack changes at the leading edge, but it hasn't reached the trailing edge of the wing yet, and that's where you get less, this lift here goes away, and you get maybe a little bubble of, let's not call it lift. So it's that transition period where your lower pressure that was here has now moved to here because your angle of attack went from this direction to this direction. You get the lower pressure here, but you still have higher pressure here. The wing folds, and that's where you get your collapse. Now what happens after the wing collapses? The wing collapses and it makes this shape. You get a huge increase in drag this direction. That increase in drag, but remember the pilot has inertia and he's hung 6 feet below the wing. So the pilot, object in motion, wants to remain in motion unless acted upon by an outside force. So the pilot wants to remain in motion. He continues flying at 25 miles an hour, but now you have a huge increase in drag on the airfoil. The airfoil rocks backwards behind the pilot, which regains this angle of attack to the wing. So when the wing rocks backwards, now airflow hits it from this direction, which brings the leading edge back up in line with the trailing edge, and then the wing surges forward because it wants to regain this angle of attack that it was trimmed for at the factory. You will have to excuse my drawing abilities and my rudimentary way of explaining, because I'm not an artist and I'm not good enough on the computer to know how to do this all digitally. So I'm just going to draw it on a board and hope you guys figure it out. So why do we get an asymmetric collapse sometimes and a frontal collapse other times? It just depends on the airflow that you're flying in. Did you exit the thermal symmetrically all at the same time with the wing? Or did only one wingtip exit the thermal first, gave you that negative angle of attack, collapsed one half of the wing? You guys like my little shark nose that I drew right here? That's a little shark nose airfoil. So just think about in flight, the air that we're flying is constantly moving. It's up and down. The wind speed increases, decreases. And so while you're flying and you feel these little turbulences in your glider and you feel your glider rock back and forth, if you imagine the angle of attack at the leading edge of your glider, it's constantly changing like this. In really strong air, the changes are greater. And there's a certain point where the wing either stalls when the angle of attack gets this steep. That's when the wing can stall because the airflow can't stay connected to the glider. It breaks free up here. And that's when you get your stall. Or you get a collapse when the angle of attack becomes so shallow that you lose your low pressure area here and you maybe gain a low pressure area here, and that's where you get your collapse, your fold, high drag, pilot continues in motion, wing rocks back, wing reopens because the angle of attack is regained when the wing rocked backwards, wing reinflates quickly as air is forced into the inlets, and then it surges forward because it wants to regain the angle of attack that the wing was trimmed for at the factory. Let's talk about using the brakes and how that prevents collapse or causes a stall, because that's something else that the brakes can do for you. Your brakes bring your wing backwards and it changes the trim from the factory of the glider, and it changes the angle of attack. If you hold your brakes constantly, let's say you hold 4 centimeters of brake travel, you reduce your airspeed. Your sink rate may change slightly, but essentially what you're doing is you're changing your angle of attack to here. That might give you more lift because you're creating a larger low pressure area here over the wing, but you're also creating more drag, especially deflecting the trailing edge. You may get some little portion of the airfoil that's stalled behind you. You're creating higher drag, reduces your airspeed. Sink rate may stay the same because your low pressure area is still greater and your angle of attack decreases like this. You continue to hold it and slow down more and more and more and more. Eventually your angle of attack gets so steep that the airfoil then that used to look like this from your angle of attack and it stayed attached. Now your airflow tries to stay attached and it can't, so it breaks free. Huge drag increase from all the turbulence. Back here, the wing rocks backwards when you stall it. And then, once again, you release the brakes. The wing wants to surge forward to regain the angle of attack that it was trimmed for. Paramotor pilots can, on paramotor wings that come with trims, you can adjust the trim of the glider at the factory. That changes the angle of attack that the wing wants to fly at. If you're flying a classic profile wing with trimmers, as we talked about before, you're getting closer to that negative angle of attack range. So if you trim out on a classic profile wing and you increase your airspeed, maybe your sink rate is well increased. Now your angle of attack has moved to this location. You're closer to that point of moving the low pressure area. That means if you fly through some turbulence, it takes less turbulence to bring that angle of attack to a negative angle of attack. It takes less turbulence for that to happen and make your wing collapse when you're trimmed out or on speed bar on a classic profile wing. Most classic profile wings only use a speed bar. so that if this happens and you take a collapse, you release the bar, the trim is returned, the trim of the glider is returned to normal, and when the glider reinflates, it's trimmed back to that normal angle of attack that we saw before. Here's the difference of a reflex profile wing and a classic profile wing. On this classic profile wing, as your angle of attack changes, that low pressure area that creates your lift changes as well. So at the normal angle of attack range, that low pressure area is right here, and that's where your lift is being created. As you decrease the angle of attack and the airflow flows over the wing this way, that low pressure area shifts towards the rear of the glider. And as you pull on the brakes and you reduce your airspeed, that low pressure area will be towards the leading edge of the glider. That's what happens on a classic profile wing. So if you could measure the tension on these lines as the pilot pushed on the speed bar on a classic profile wing, you would see the load distribution changing on these lines. You would get less load on your A's and more load on your B's and C's as you increase your speed and reduce your angle of attack. Now let's talk about a reflex wing. So I've redrawn the airfoil into my ugly version of a reflex profile wing. So here's the difference in a reflex wing. As you trim out and increase your speed and your angle of attack changes, the part of the wing that creates lift, this low pressure area, so this low pressure area that was here with our normal angle of attack, and then you decrease your angle of attack because your airspeed increases, and it was supposed to move your pressure area back here. How much this area of lift changes is much less on a reflex wing. At higher angles of attack, you may get your lift here. Lower angles of attack, you may get your lift here. But the main point is that it stays over the A-lines. And remember when we flew through that sink before, that was coming down here while we still had lift here? That's what we created our collapse before. But now the trailing edge is deflected up and we've shifted where the lift is created on the wing. So because of the shape of the airfoil, as you decrease your angle of attack, the low pressure area where the lift is created does not shift aft near as much as it did on a classic profile wing. That comes with disadvantages as well. The glide ratio is sacrificed a little bit by this. Your sink rate is going to be increased because of that. So it's not a perfect solution, but for the type of flying down low where you want collapse resistance, especially when flying faster, it's a great solution. It's a tool that you can use on a paramotor. Like I mentioned before, if you could measure the tension on these lines as you accelerated and decrease your angle of attack on a reflex wing, the tension, you put more load on the A lines and release load on the D, C, and B lines as you accelerate and change the angle of attack. Versus a classic profile wing, the tension is reduced from the A lines and it's increased on the B's and C's as you change your angle of attack. So that's the main difference, and it means that the wing is way more collapse resistant when you're flying at lower angles of attack at higher speeds on a reflex wing versus a classic profile wing. That doesn't mean that this wing is 100% bulletproof, but people always ask, how collapse resistant is a reflex wing? What does it take to collapse one? I've thought about it for a while. I've never experienced it myself. I've never experienced a reflex wing collapsing when you've released tension on the D, C, and B lines and you have all the lift being created on the A's. In my opinion, for this to happen, you would have to enter sync that is greater than the acceleration that the pilot can free fall at. So I looked up the numbers really quick, and Gravity is, you accelerate in free fall at a rate of 9.8 meters per second, which equals to about 1,929 feet per minute. So in my opinion, to collapse a reflex wing, you would have to fly from normal air through a transition period of sink where air is accelerating downwards at a rate of around 1,900 feet per minute. That number is possible to reach. There are people who climb in thermals that are at this rate or even greater than this rate on a regular basis every year. So that tells me that you can find air that is strong enough to collapse a reflex wing. However, your typical paramotor pilot on his morning flight or his evening flight on a day when weather checked out to be good to fly, it's highly, highly unlikely that you're just going to come across some air that is climbing or sinking at 1,900 feet per minute. That is a really, really fast climb rate or sink rate. Remember that if there's a place where air is climbing and it's making a little cloud, if the air goes up, air has to fill the void somewhere, right? So this air went up here, that means somewhere else there's some sink going down to fill this void of air that went up. And that's the game of paragliding, is trying to stay in this and stay out of this. But so it is possible. Just keep that in mind, that you need to choose your weather days appropriately. And as long as you're doing your normal, typical paramotor flight and you don't encounter 1,900 feet per minute sink rates on a reflex wing, you really don't have much to worry about. That's my opinion on the subject, and that's how I understand how this works. Hope you learned something. Hope you found this educational. And if you got any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. I like to talk about this stuff and learn as much as I can from other people and get their experience as well, and try and figure out things that people do wrong. We can learn from each other and make each other better, safer pilots in the long run. So thanks for watching.